In the fourth quarter of 2022, the Malaysian economy recorded a growth of 7.0%, supported by continued expansion in domestic demand, sustained recovery in labor market, resilient demand for E&E products, and recovery in tourism activities. The moderation from the high growth in the third quarter of 2022 reflects waning support from stimulus measure and the low base effect from the negative growth in the third quarter of 2021. For 2022 as a whole, the Malaysian economy expanded by 8.7%. On a seasonal adjusted quarter-on-quarter basis, GDP declined by 2.6%. It was 1.9% in the third quarter of 2022. On the supply side, all sectors continue to expand. Growth in the services sector continue to be supported by both consumer and business-related services, following better labor market condition and the continued recovery in tourism activities. The manufacturing sector was driven mainly by the expansion in E&E cluster and supported by the primary and consumer clusters amid higher petrochemical output as well as fulfillment of motor vehicle backlogs. The agriculture sector continued to expand as oil palm production benefited from improved yield following higher rainfall earlier in 2022 and easing labor shortage. Growth in the mining sectors was supported by sustained production from crude oil and natural gas facilities. As for construction sector, growth was driven mainly by the continued progress of large infrastructure, non-commercial and industrial projects in civil engineering and non-residential subsector. On the demand side, growth was supported by private sector expenditure. Private consumption growth was underpinned by improving labor market condition and policy measures. Spending was driven by consumption of necessity and discretionary items such as transport, housing, and utilities, as well as recreational services and culture. Growth in private investment was driven by capital spending in both structures and machinery and equipment (EME) by firm. The expansion in public investment reflects continued capital expenditure by public corporation. Public consumption growth remained supported mainly by government supply and services spending. Net export of goods and services recorded a strong growth mainly on account of resilient demand for E&E export and higher travel receipt. Before I hand over to Governor, I will also to recap on our overall growth of the year 2022 is the highest. 8.7% is highest for the last 22 years. It's mainly because maybe also because of the base effect, and of course in our press statement also we also show some of comparison the level of GDP for 2022 compared to GDP before the pandemic 2019. So most of the sector, three main sectors still are negative. Only sector manufacturing and services on the positive territory compared to 2019. But if we look at the subsector of the services, still subsector that related to the tourism, like accommodation, food and beverages, and also industry that related to the construction activity in the business services also still in the negative territory compared to 2019. What I try to mention is, beside the overall growth is strong, 8.7, but there are certain subsectors is still below the level of 2019. This also contributed mainly because our inbound travel in before the pandemic, we received about close to about 80 million received from the inbound travel, but in 2022 we only received about 27 billion. That the reason why the certain sector like accommodation, food and beverage still not come back to the pre-pandemic level.
Dah lah, cukup lah ya.